Okay, let's dive right in. VFX in the color bay. That's our webinar today. That's a very large topic. So we're going to sort of break down this complex topic into a bunch of little areas. And before we get started, I just wanted to go over some general theory. So all that VFX in the color bay is every time that you have been sitting in your color session or you've been a client in a color session sitting with your colorist and you ask the colorist, uh, hey, I know we're in a grading session, but you see that boom that just popped into frame, or you see that pimple on her face, or you see whatever it is, and you ask them, can it be done? In the past, obviously, the answer was no. Let us walk you over here to this flame room, and they'll take care of it over here. What's going on lately is you're getting the opportunity to say no less and less. Uh, VFX are starting to get done in the color bay. Um, in order for that to happen, you have to be on a system that allows you to do that. And basically, at the moment, there's two groups of systems. There are the pure color correctors, and I'm sure we all know which ones those are, that are basically designed just to color correct, not to do any kind of image manipulation beyond, what is considered pure color correction. And then there are the group of systems, which is probably a larger pool, of hybrid systems. And these are systems that have all kinds of varying capability. They basically are powerful conform, color correctors, powerful compositors, and mastering systems all in one application or all in one GUI. And those are the systems that are going to allow you to do more than just pure color correction. And depending on your skill level and how much you want to learn, the sky is almost the limit as to what can be done in those systems. And what a grading session becomes is more of a hybrid session of grading and finishing, where you're doing all kinds of manipulation. You're color correcting a little bit, then you're finding a little thing that needs to be painted out, then you're putting an object in here and there, you're tracking this and that, and it becomes more of a free-form finishing session as opposed to just purely grading. Scratch obviously falls squarely in the middle of the category of hybrid systems that can do almost anything. Um, so depending on your level of ambitiousness, you can do almost anything in Scratch. But you do have to be on one of these hybrid systems, or the facility you're working with has to be on one of these hybrid systems to be able to do the things that we're going to be looking at today. So some other quick things to go over before we get started. This webinar, we're not going to do a click-by-click tutorial of each of the things that we're going to do. That would take way too long. Instead, what we're going to try to do is sort of spark your imagination in terms of the theory of how we're doing things. We're going to break certain minor effects or moderate effects down piece by piece and look at individual mats and things like that. Hopefully it'll translate more universally to other systems or the way that you want to work, not specifically here's where you click on this thing. Another reason for doing it that way is you may want to accomplish a visual effect in a very different way than I do or that somebody else does, but the theory stays the same between all the ways you could accomplish something. So again, in this webinar, we're going to be looking at a lot of theory and breakdowns of various examples, not click-by-click ways to do things. One last thing. In these finishing systems, everything is pretty much real time. And on my side here, I see everything in real time. But because this is over the internet webinar, you're going to be seeing things at about 3 to 7 frames a second. So things may look a little choppy to you. When you're in a session, obviously all of this is going to be real time. And anything that you see in this webinar is going to be playing back in real time. Okay, so let's dive right in. I'm going to pull this one up. So the whole should you do something versus can you do something is an interesting place to start, because once you open up the door to being able to do almost anything in a hybrid system, what the exercise becomes is more of budget management and time management. Not, well, it's not even an issue to discuss because we can't do it. Once you can do a lot of things, you really have to start managing your client's expectations more than trying to get the box to do things that it doesn't want to do. So this is an argument I like to call could versus should, and this is a perfect example of that. So this is a scene from a film that we just completed. It's a dream sequence, uh, part of a larger sequence where a boy is riding his tricycle in the middle of the desert on an empty road, and it's supposed to be a little bit surreal, as you can see. We've got a lens flare coming in here, get some grain. It's supposed to be a little bit heightened. We could actually even add some more contrast to this and be even happier. Somewhere in there. Um, so this is a visual effect, and it may or may not be obvious. This is the plate that we actually started from on this one. And the reason this is a visual effect is because it is pretty unsafe to put a young boy in the middle of the road, no matter how few cars there are around. This is a show that I was the VFX soup on, and so we decided that it would be easier. It's also very far away, this plate. This was 4 hours driving away. So it would be easier to just, in the parking lot of our building in Santa Monica, put this green screen together and do the rest as a comp. And I think this was pretty successful. Yeah. So you could do this effect in the DI, in Scratch, in real time in front of your clients. Do you want to? I would argue no. Obviously, the way you would start to put this together, this is the plate. Let's go grab the boy so you can see what the process would start to look like and see how simple it would be. I'm just going to use one of my keyers here, get a nice clean key, throw him in a garbage mat, and I'm going to be very careful about the tire down there. Okay, so as soon as we close this, you should start to be able to see how this effect is going to work. Okay, so now he's separated. Let's just track him onto, let me be organized and call him boy. Track him onto the background, and you'll see how this is going to start pulling together. Okay, so now he sort of sits on the road with the same jiggle and movement of the camera. Okay, so pretty crude, but you can see that if you sat here and spent the time, you could get this to be final. And this, again, this is all within what is classified as a color system. So it took one of our artists 6 hours to get this comp to be at this level. And so this involved, depending on how much VFX knowledge you have, forgive me if I'm stating the obvious, some quite a bit of grading, some grain addition to match the background and the foreground grain. We added a shadow down here in 3D space, make him look like he was really on the road. We added a sun flare over here, and we threw the background out of focus a little bit, appropriate to where he would be versus the camera. So basically in 6 hours, and some of you are going to say, well, I could do that in 2 hours. Great, you could do it in 2 hours. That's not the point. In 6 hours, we went from here to here. So the could versus should argument is basically, just because you can do something in a system, is it necessarily a good use of yours and your client's time? And I would say, obviously, this isn't a good use of your time to have the client come in for a color session and be paying that large hourly rate and then have them sit there for 6 hours while you noodle with the grain and the way the flare works and things like that. Just because you can doesn't mean you should. So in this case, I would say this is a shot that we would ship out to a different room and basically explain to the client, yes, we can, let's do that. Let's let somebody else in a room that's not being billed at this very high rate. Basically, this is the room that we're sitting in right now. Uh, let's not uh, do this visual effect in this environment. You're going to get the a better result for a lot less money in the room next door, and let us spend the 6 hours continuing to set the overall look of the film. It's a much better use of yours and our time. So really, when you're approaching um, any visual effect in the grading session, your first question should not be how are we going to accomplish it? Oh, let me get started. It should be a time and budget question of, is this worth doing in the color session, or are we going to get more bang for our buck by outsourcing this to a VFX artist or outsourcing it within your own facility to another room? And sort of my barometer for that, sometimes it's hard to make that call. I just do a time estimate on everything. If something is going to take longer than 5 minutes to do in front of clients, I just nix it. I just say, not worth it. Let's send that out to another room, because I found that both our clients and our patients runs out, somewhere between 3 to 5 minutes. It sounds like a small amount of time, but when you're sitting here watching me just kind of tinker, you're looking at 10 seconds here. After 3 minutes of this, there's just a perception in the room like we're not getting anything done, and people start calculating, oh, we have 3 more reels of the film to do, let's get moving. So I would say if you look at a shot and think that's going to take more than 5 minutes, I mean, 3 minutes should be luxurious. 5 minutes should be like absolute breaking point. If it's going to take more than 5 minutes, don't do it in the color bay. At least that's my suggestion. Also, let's thank you for asking questions as we go throughout. We're going to answer those all after the webinar, and those are going to be moderated by Marcelo. So you can ask your questions, but we're going to get to them at the end. Okay, so let's move on from could versus should and start at the very basics. These examples are going to get a little bit more complex as we go along, so we're going to start very, very basic. Basically, this is the first example of something that crosses the line from just pure color correction into what used to be called VFX, and that's tone mapping, or some people call it advanced power windows. So in this image, this is captured on the red, and it's shot very well. These guys are stuck inside a bank. Good exposure on them, good exposure overall. So this is the raw. And what you can see is they couldn't push enough light through this window. This window was knocking the amount of light down, and they had to get an exposure on their faces, they had to hit this door. This is glass here, obviously. They had to hit this door with a lot of light, and they got a lot of bounce on the metal frame of the door here. So what ended up happening is the door features more prominently than the people. So traditionally, as you would grade this, you would bring the whole thing up. So this was the look. This is the look for this movie. And so as we brought the whole grade up to get their faces to where or at least hers, to where we wanted it, obviously we blew out the door. And then we actually also added just a little window on this guy's face to sort of bring him up to the same level as everybody else. There we go. So in the past, you would have had to either accept this or get into some really tricky windows where you would now try to do shapes around this thing and feather them in interesting ways and bring them down. And what you would be doing is basically bringing down an already clipped white, and it would just end up looking very manipulated and muddy. So instead of going that way, we've gotten into some tone mapping. Since it's not overexposed on the negative, we have a lot of options here. We can do a key based on luminance. I just used a luminance keyer here, so basically we may as well just do it again. So we've keyed the very, very hottest highlights here in this clipped version, and we've told Scratch here to go non-recursive and to punch through this initial color correct and go back and get this area from the negative. So what we get is something like this, where we've got in this area we've got a blended version of two color corrects. One that is basically everything except for the door is one color correct, and the door itself is basically just us punching back through to the negative and not really changing it that much. If you look at this area of the door, between what's on the negative and what the color correct has done, it basically stays in place. So the goal of that is to retain all the detail that we can in that door, and we're doing that now. And if you look at this now, it doesn't look particularly unnatural or anything. It just looks like they had more light on the inside than they really had, and the door was properly flagged off or whatever it was. And you could tweak this to your heart's content. You know, now we have individual control over the highlights on the door, so you can decide, no, I like to blow it out to about that level. It looks more photographic to me. Or no, I have to have all the detail in there, and you can really push it so that you're just getting a little blend here, but you can really kind of exaggerate it. As long as it's not clipped on the negative, you really have an immense amount of control. So if you look at this, it doesn't right away tell you that this is highly manipulated up here. It just looks like they had the appropriate amount of light on this scene. So this would, let's see what other effect it's having. Yeah, so if you look around, it's pulling detail into a lot of things. Like this poster over here, it's taking a white clip and bringing a lot of more natural color in there. Maybe I'll just bring it up to about there. Yeah, so that's an example of more advanced windowing that doesn't involve just drawing shapes and bringing certain things up or knocking other things down. It's actually combining two exposures in a way. It's basically what I call the negative, you know, the digital negative acts like a negative. It's basically scanning it twice the way you would scan a film negative to retain as much of the low end and the high end. Sometimes you'd scan that negative twice and then do a kind of comp where you were combining them into a high dynamic range image. You're doing the same thing here. So, you know, the next time that you're bringing things up and noticing that things are getting clipped in the digital negative, go back and look at the negative and see if it's clipped in the negative. If it's not clipped in the negative, you should have the latitude to do pretty much whatever you want. Okay, so that's one example. That's a pretty basic example, but I would say this crosses the line into VFX. Let's move on. So this is probably the most the thing that you're going to run into the most, which is simple object removal. Things pop into the frame all the time that you don't want there. You know, mics are the most common thing, obviously. In this shot, everything was fine except bang, we saw the mic right there. So in the past, you'd have to ship that out to VFX. In a color bay, you know, that was not something that was part of your responsibilities. In this case, this is a very simple paint out. This is one that we did on a film recently, and there were about 20 to 30 of these boom pop-ins. Nobody's fault. It's not that big a deal. The production always jokes, like, don't tell everybody that's not that big a deal because then they'll get sloppy with their booms. But the way we would tackle this is we would look at the moment when it comes in and see what we can grab from around it. It's also a moving shot, so you're going to have to track. So basically we've got clean material before it comes in, then it comes in. We've got clean material for a second after it comes out, but not a lot. So in this case, what we'll do, or what we did, is we found a frame. Let's see where it was. Oh, he was already down. So we found a frame that had the most clean material and just made a still of it, freeze frame of it. And we just used a little patch of the still and tracked it on and made sure that it animated on and off correctly, and we got this. Which if you look at it at full res, full size, this is the same shot, no mic, and you can't tell the difference. And this took about a minute to do in the actual final DI. So you know, clients very happy to be able to see that happening in real time. They really get a kick out of that. And this is the basically this is the still frame, and this is the little patch that we brought in the still frame. And if you look at my hash marks here, actually I'll show it to you this way. This is the frame that it animates from 0 opacity to 100. It sits there on its track for a minute, and then it animates again from 100 opacity to 0 and back down. So by the time that we're here, it's completely transparent and off, so that we basically use as few frames as possible with a still frame up there. If you wanted to go further, you could do match grain and stuff like that. In this case, it wasn't necessary. So if we were to turn this off, you'd see, boop, you'd see the mic, and if we turn it on, it magically disappears. Clients love seeing that. One more time, this is the actual track of the little shape. Yep. So even looking at this now, it sort of comes into his hair just a little bit. If you wanted to, after the fact, you could adjust this. So let's just bring it out to about here, soften the edge. I'm sure that it still covers the mic, and after the fact, we've adjusted it, it still covers the mic. And the shape just goes right out of frame. Floop. Okay. Once again, this is the final on this shot. It's like it was never there. That's the thing you're going to run into the most if you haven't already. All right, slightly more advanced example. Believe it or not, whenever I show this shot, this is from the same film. People are just shocked because, believe it or not, the production this is a hero shot of the film for theatrical release. The production got all the way through their production, their dailies, their 4-month editorial, and into DI, and were sitting in the DI theater before they noticed this very obvious crew member walking in the background. And you know, once you see him, you think, "Oh my God, how could you have missed that?" And he's even carrying the slate, you know, so it's like really hits you over the head. So while we were in the color bay, you know, there was this sort of mild freak out where they were thinking, "Oh God, we love his little look there. What are we going to do? We're going to have to switch this shot out. We're going to have to pay for an expensive visual effect to have this guy rotoed out, and you know, have all this material back here. He walks right in front of this guy." I mean, it was just like worst case scenario. Another thing that we were thinking about doing is just maybe comping this face onto another take or something like that. While they were having that argument, I was looking at the shot thinking, you know, there's got to be a way. It's a static shot. There's got to be a way to solve this. So within 3 minutes, we solved this shot in a very, very simple way. If you look at the frames before the guy walks through and after, it's totally static. So in theory, you should be able to just paint out whatever you want of this shot. You could if you spent enough time, just paint the guy out entirely. But instead, what we ended up doing is just painting out the slate. And this took about 3 minutes. We did it live in front of them, and they just loved it. And it made the shot work. If the guy's not carrying a slate, then this tool belt doesn't mean anything. He could be a plumber or an electrician or something, which is appropriate to this scene. This is happening inside of an old person's home, and there are plumbers walking around, and he could be one of them. So we just painted out that slate in about 3 minutes, and that was that. Obviously, clients were thrilled that a 3-minute solution solved this problem that they were going to have with this shot. And the way we did it may be obvious to some of you. It's just a little shape here that is tracked to where the slate was. Some of it is manually tracked, some of it is um, automatically tracked, and it's sort of manually adjusted as we go. And all we did was, I'm going to make a separate version of this just for protection, is just use frames from before he ever walked through. So this is the frames from when he was walking through, even from behind the jacket, no big deal. If we just push the frames back, this is 2 frames before he walked through, you can see us actually pushing the slate out of frame. It's kind of incredible. So we figured out that 5 frames was enough. So within this little box, it's just searching for 5 frames before he ever walked through. And it doesn't have to be super perfect in this shot. A quick solution did the trick. It's seamless. And another reason it's seamless is he doesn't move his jacket that much. So, here as as our little box is going through, it is interfering with his jacket a little bit, but he's so still for those few frames that it just looks like a little wiggle in his jacket. You really can't tell anything at full res. Very important to look at these things at full res. When you're looking at something under a microscope, it may not hold up to muster, but looking at something at full size. So anyhow, that was the solution on this shot. And once you know the trick of looking for frames before and after and being able to just roll the frames around, then this looks pretty simple. But to be able to go from this guy clearly walking with a slate to this in 3 minutes in front of clients in real time is, I think, really valuable. Of course, it opens up the can of worms because after they see that, then they're starting to think about what else do we want to paint out of the movie. And so again, gets back to that argument of could versus should. Then you're starting to convince them that use of their time is what they should be considering, not what's possible. So there you go. That is simple to moderate object removal. So let's move on to beauty work. So I'm sure you're all aware that beauty work gets done on the majority of all images that you see on a TV screen or on a movie screen. All commercials have some kind of beauty work done. Actually, maybe TV doesn't. But all commercials and the majority of feature films, especially the larger ones, have beauty work done to their actors and actresses. And it's not because people aren't, these actors and actresses aren't beautiful. Obviously, she's gorgeous. I think she's a Victoria's Secret model or something like that. It's that there are just some natural imperfections in the skin that happen sometimes, or the way the angle of the light hits somebody is kind of a little bit unflattering to some pores, or just happened to be a day where somebody had a pimple or something like that. No big deal. So in this shot, we just took this. This may be very subtle looking, but it has a big psychological effect. We just took it from here to here. And the reason why this is sort of subtly effective, I think, is because the main details of her face, the eyes, the front of the nose, and the lips and the hair, stay completely unaffected. And really what we're doing is just smoothing out some of the bumps and pimples and things like that. So you shouldn't, at full res here, you might think this is a little bit heavy, but at full res here, you shouldn't feel much. And the reason we pushed it to this degree on this shot is because this is also a dream sequence, and she's supposed to be, 4 years, 5 years younger than she is, and supposed to be very angelic and pure looking, supposed to be almost a little bit heightened. So I'll just run through the various small things that we did on this shot and hopefully give you some tips and tricks on when you're doing beauty work on your own. Again, thing to remember is we haven't switched systems. This has all been inside the exact same system. We haven't switched modules. This is all inside your color corrector. Uh, are some bumpiness on the nose. Um, there's a little bit of like discoloration here, some bumpiness down here, a couple pimples. Let's see what else we got. We got this beauty mark, which is not a pimple, but just reads as a pimple for some reason, and this one too. So in this example, we're going to be breaking down some basic beauty work. This is not super advanced, but this is about the level that I would think is appropriate in a color session. Again, the whole argument of could versus should. We're going to take it from here to here. So I'm just going to go through the various parts of this one by one. So I'm going to go turn off all my layers here of beauty work, and we'll look at to see what each one is doing. So in this first layer, we're just going to attack general skin softness, and what we've done here obviously is just do a power window around the eyes, inverted it, and then keyed the skin. So in theory, it's grabbing a little bit of hair, not a big deal. It should be just grabbing things that are skin colored or close to skin color, so it's getting most of what I want. And when we turn this off, you'll see that we've just added some overall softness to this, and it's got the skin, and that's good. It's taking care of a lot of the issues that we were having with the bumpiness of the skin. But it's also blurred the nose and blurred the mouth and blurred everything else and some of the hair and things like that. So what we're going to do now is just go and do holdouts on the things that we want to keep. So the next thing we did was track another shape onto the nose and punch through our blur layer to get back detail on the nose. That looks good. So now we're getting blur on the cheeks, but not on the nose. Next one was the mouth. So we did a pretty specific shape here, tracked it right onto the mouth. And again, this is a holdout, so this is going to be punching through our blur layer. And now we've got detail back onto the mouth. You can see it has pretty drastic effect when you're not holding out these details. You're just going to blur right over them, and that's what makes it look really manipulated. So we're getting all the detail back on the mouth within this shape. Okay. What do we do next? Head paint. Okay. So this one was just taking care of that little beauty mark, which is not a pimple, but just reads as a pimple. So we had to get rid of it, or the client wanted us to get rid of it. So again, we tracked a little shape there right to that. Obviously, this makes for a very good tracking point. Tracked it right to that little shape, and then we just stole a little bit of skin texture from over here and rolled it over to here. You may be able to see the shape slightly here, but again, at full res, that just looks like it's gone. That pimple just looks like it's totally disappeared. Okay. Next thing we did, forehead blur. Okay. So we just took, let's take a look here what it did. There's just some general bumpiness here that we want to get rid of. We just did another shape, tracked it to the forehead. You can see the area that it's affecting, added some more softness there. So we continue to add layers and layers of softness. Chin work down here. We got this little area here, Added again some more softness just specifically to a little area. Let's see what it was doing. Yeah, and this is subtle stuff, but the end result is the psychological end result is large. See, we're just taking these little bumps in this discoloration here and smoothing it right out, but just within this little shape right there. And then I'm sure there was one more. Let's find out. Yeah, right there. So there must have been another, yeah, another little patch of discoloration and bumpiness. Um, one more little shape took care of that. As you can see it working there. So the end result is something that, I mean, we could continue working on this, but we did this in about 4 minutes in front of clients, and I think it was the appropriate amount of work to do inside the color bay. We basically took it from this beautiful shot, but she's got some imperfections in her skin, to this same shot, but her skin is pearly smooth and more appropriate for the scene. Okay, beauty work in the grading session. So let's move on now to even more advanced example. So this is probably the most I would recommend to try to accomplish in a DI session, sky replacement. So this is painting objects into a scene. In this case, it's a beautiful shot here in Echo Park, shot on the Red Epic in 5K, and of course, um, like any perfect Southern California day, there's absolutely no clouds in the sky. It is just totally clean, and it's not supposed to be this sort of desert climate-y in the movie. It really is supposed to be a little bit more cloudy and temperate, or at least have some clouds. So the client was asking us to do all kinds of grads here in the sky to figure out how we can give this shot just some more dimension, and we just suggested, well, let's just add some clouds in. And we tried that. It took us about 5 minutes, and they were happy with that. So this is where this shot ended up. And you can see that there's clouds in the sky. They track with the rest of the shot, and the clouds are actually moving in the sky, giving the appearance of it all being very real and dynamic, so they're not just a still frame. So we took it from here to here within the color system. So on this one, we used our good old friend Google, and that's sort of my, I have a library of clouds that we use in the past, but I found that actually Google is such a good, an enormous reservoir of images that VFX artists are just using it all the time anyway. Found this one that looked to be relatively similar in terms of size of the lens, and the horizon was kind of in the right place if you look at it. Found this in a couple minutes in front of the client actually, and then what we did was I just took the sky that was there. I just wanted it to be a little bit bluer before we got started. So we just did a key onto the sky and just turned it from LA happy smog, dusty smog color to just a little bit more traditional blue sky, because I knew that it would look funny if puffy white clouds were sitting in a brown sky. So that's the sky there. And then all we did with the clouds was we brought them in just as a still frame texture layer, and then we just keyed out the blue. So we actually used this natural blue that's in here as its own blue screen. And so what we did is maybe I can, since we have a lot of time left on our clock, maybe I can do this again in front of you. You can see how this works. So I just looked for the areas between the clouds, and actually right here on the edges with Scratch's keyer here, and got a good key. And what this is doing is it's only bringing in the actual cloud texture. It's not bringing with it any of the mountains. It's not bringing with it any of this blue sky or any of the grain that exists in there. It's just bringing in these white puffy clouds, which make this, uh, save a new version, which makes this very malleable because these are now perfectly alpha'd elements that we could place anywhere. You know, we could place them lower in the sky. That doesn't look too realistic. Higher in the sky, we could scale them to whatever degree we want, blur them, whatever you want to do with them. Very flexible. Let me go back to my finished version. And then the most important thing is obviously we track them. In this case, I did a 2-point track on the palm tree here. It's a nice tracker point right there and right there. So I got the movement of the camera and the scaling. And Scratch actually allows you to work in 3D space. So in this case, you can just grab any texture layer, any layer for that matter, and just move it around in 3D space, adjust the camera angle of the viewer camera that you're looking at. So in this case, instead of just having it flat on like this, which looked a little bit like they weren't on the right perspective, I just spun them, spun the clouds to sort of face us a little bit more in 3D space, and then sort of rotated them so they looked a little bit more realistic. Maybe I'll just spin them to a side just for fun like that. I'll trim everything and it all stays locked. Looking at this, I wish they were a little higher, so I'm just going to move them up. Trim, okay. A couple other things that went into this. I'm using, instead of just doing a normal straight opacity, I'm using some of the advanced compositing modes here in Scratch. You know, we could, if you're familiar with Photoshop and After Effects, you're familiar with how things add or multiply on top of each other, and you get, you know, drastically different effects depending on what you use. So in this case, hard light looked the best. It basically took the edges and blended them the nicest with the background. And then we rolled the opacity down to 75%. So in this case, because you've got this built now, even here in your color system, you can just sit here and say, okay, when does it look realistic to me? You know, they're just a little too present. I'm just going to roll it down to about there. So what is that? 80%? 81%? Let's just make that a clean 80% just for simplicity. So that started looking good. And then you'll notice they're moving. They're just slowly drifting. And that throughout the whole shot, that helps you know, give them the feeling that they're real and they actually have some movement to them and they're not just a still frame. And that was just accomplished by simply here in the texture layer doing a an X movement. But the shot is short enough. You could do stuff that's more complex than that, but the shot is short enough to where adding just that little bit of motion gave it a realistic movement. You know, now looking at this, I think they're tilted too far to one side, so I'll just change it. And the last thing that we did here that is very important, probably, you know, one of the most important parts, is the holdout matte. So if you just slap them on top, the clouds sort of sit in front of the palm trees. Even though they're transparent, they sit in front of the palm trees, they sit in front of things, and it just doesn't look as realistic. It kind of looks like what's wrong with these palm trees over here. So we just did another layer, and we did a luma key based on shadows, and we just told Scratch here to hold out anything that was a pure shadow. And because there's nothing in the clouds that even approaches the luminance of these, what it did is it perfectly cut out all these foreground elements against the sky and put the foreground elements back onto the shot. So I think that sort of completed it. These trees look realistic now. The clouds are actually tracking and moving behind the trees. we went further and did a little bit of a final grade of everything together. Now that you've got this comp done, you can obviously color correct all of this together as if it was shot this way. Another added benefit of doing it this way. Um, so let's just get that to look good to where we had it. Okay, we're happy there. Now we just went in depth on this shot, but we slapped this together in 5 minutes, and this is a final that ended up in the film. Um, this is about as extreme and as far as I would personally go. Again, it's that 5 minute rule for me in the color bay. But this is an example of something that a few years ago, or even in a pure color system today, is just unthinkable in the color session. And we're just getting to that point with these systems now that stuff like this is possible. So we've gotten to the end of what we normally would show in this webinar, but we've got a little bit of extra time, so maybe we'll just take a sneak peek at the bonus material that is available for this webinar um, to everybody that signed up and is going to watch it on demand. We're not going to do the entire thing, but basically the bonus material that comes with this webinar is an example of real HDR tone mapping. This is, I would say, about as complex as the sky replacement example. Basically, the Red Epic, and in the future other cameras will have this as well, can do a sort of dual exposure mode, where they can take two exposures at almost at the same time, and one exposure is for the low end and one exposure is for the high end. And I shot this as an example of a shot that would not be possible to get a correct exposure out of without a dual exposure system. There's just no camera in the world, no film camera, no video camera, no digital camera that could hold 18 stops of latitude like this is. This part of her face is correctly exposed. This is the raw. And we've got stuff that is 9, 10 stops hotter outside and naturally would blow out. With a dual exposure camera, you get the ability to comp these two exposures together, and depending on your skill level, you can get it to look pretty realistic, or at least have full control over how this image looks. So we used Scratch here, and you may or may not have seen other tutorials of me doing this, to basically take the highlights of one exposure, comp them into this exposure, and then create a high dynamic range image, and it's a motion image. She walks right through the door into the shadows here. And we got this. So at first glance, you may not think this looks that unique, but this is basically an exposure that can only be achieved in a high dynamic range a kind of scenario where we're holding both inside and outside. And now that you've created this, you have control over where the highlights blow out. So then it's up to you to decide, well, I think that looks realistic, or I think we could get away with that, or I think we could get away with that. Depending on what the needs of the shot are, it's an incredibly powerful tool. I would say this is also the future of color correction, is basically setting exposure in post. Whether you philosophically agree with that or not, this is another level of where VFX in the color bay is going. Okay, well, I think we've basically come to the end. I hope that wasn't too much of a waterfall of information. I hope it just opens your eyes a little bit and your imagination a little bit to some of the things that are possible today and where this is sort of all going, and gives you the inspiration to try your skill set. And that's it for our webinar today.
Okay, here's an interesting one. It's applying some of these theories to Color 1.5, which is that Apple Color app. Can some of these theories be applied to, it doesn't have to be just Apple Color, to other apps besides Scratch?
Yes, absolutely. Like we talked about, two groups of systems. The systems that fall into hybrid systems will be able to do pretty much all of this, if not, all of this. And the pure color correctors will be able to do probably the sort of simple tone mapping stuff, like this example. That you could still argue is pure color correction, and some of the beauty work. You probably will be able to blur parts of faces, but you won't be able to paint out actual spots and things like that. Apple color, I would place in the pure color corrector um, category. So I don't think it would Apple color be able to do the things that are considered real VFX. You'd have to be in one of these hybrid systems.
Yep. On the second example with the doors, do you color correct the final composite or each plate separately?
I think you mean this one.
Yeah,
Um,
exactly.
so you kind of do both. You first grade the overall, and then you pull in an area of protection where you're going punching back to the negative, and then you're grading that to you're sort of settling that into place. So I guess you're grading it. You're grading that separately. And then once you have that, you can just as easily create a new layer and grade the whole thing together as if it was shot that way, and just continue on doing your work. Let's say, as an example, we now wanted to, after we did this tone mapping, we wanted to uh, light their faces a lot more and knock down everything outside of them as if it's one image. We could easily do that now. Yeah, see it coming down.
Yep.
Um, so this would be an example of us doing the tone mapping on two separate layers, and then treating it again as one big layer, and no one would know the difference. This is actually an interesting way to look at this. This is what So we've done this grade now that really focuses in on them. But if we hadn't done the protecting the negative thing, this is what this would look like. It would look pretty stepped on. So the answer is yes, both.
Yeah. Does the dual exposure camera blend two tracks or record them separately?
It records them separately. And at the moment, there's two flavors of this. The Arri Alexa does it in camera by not actually, it splits the light into onto two sensors that automatically blends them, so you get an image that is very high dynamic range to begin with. But the Epic goes a step further, the Red Epic, and actually gives you two red files. They're muxed into the same file, but it's actually two separate video layers.
I see. So, from a storage perspective, I'm assuming you need plenty of storage to do that kind of stuff.
You need exactly double.
Right, right,
It
right, right.
doubles your data rate.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, definitely.
Yeah. So if you're
Uh,
used to shooting red, and you want to shoot in HDR, it exactly doubles the data rate of that shot. So the important thing to remember is to turn it off after you don't need it anymore. You should use it sparingly, only when you run into a situation like this where you're looking through the viewfinder, you're looking at your histogram, and you're saying, oh boy, that's clipped. What can we do about this?
right, right.
Yep.
Cool. Can you build 3D LUTs for camera use with this tool set?
Absolutely. Um, as an example of that, Scratch can export a whole range of 1D, 2D, and 3D, sorry, 1D and 3D LUTs. So we'll just do a grade here. Let's say this is shot in the Alexa. So let's say we wanted to give the production something more balanced to work with. Normally I have my panels, but Marcelo has told me not to use panels because they want to see everything happening in real time, so this is a little slower than normal. So let's say that this is what the camera would normally record, and we want to send them a 3D LUT like that. I'm just going to save this out, and my options here are color correct, 1D LUT, 1D LUT MXL, 3D LUT, or Luther. So yes, you could use Scratch to create LUTs for onset.
Here's an interesting question about HDR and shooting with two cameras at different exposures if your camera doesn't shoot HDR video. Is that possible?
Well, not really, but with one camera you can't shoot HDR if it doesn't have an HDR mode. What you could do, and what I've done for fun on personal projects, is get a beam splitter rig, put two identical cameras in the beam splitter rig, and record two different exposures on two different cameras. That's the way some people are doing HDR with a non-HDR camera. But on a single a camera that does not have HDR, you can't do something like two exposures. But another thing to consider is you may not need to. Modern digital cinema cameras are so good at dynamic range that if you think you need to be in an HDR scenario, I would try exposing for the highlights and protecting the highlights and seeing if, you're probably going to get a good 11, 12, 13 stop range down to the shadows. You probably have it covered where you could, this is basically HDR as well, but with a single camera. You may be covered with just a single camera. Really, you really have to, this is a very unusual situation. You really would have to be in one of these extreme situations to need the extra 5 stops that you're going to get here.
Yeah. Let's see. Was this demo done in Scratch Lab or the full version of Scratch?
This is Scratch Finish.
And what's the difference between them? Do you know?
Yes. Scratch Lab is basically the same as Scratch Finish, except without power windows and VFX capabilities. It's really designed to be a dailies and onset tool. All the same color controls, like if we were in Scratch Lab, we could do all of the stuff that we were doing on this scene, and it's all same performance. It's all real time and all that, but it's lacking power windows and VFX and some of the finishing capabilities. So you would not be able to go in here and now relight this and start painting things out. Most of what we saw in this example is all specific, in this tutorial, is all specific to Scratch Finish.
Cool. And finally, because we're pretty much out of time, can you review the last process step to emphasize the palm trees over the clouds in the background before the overall grading in the cloud scene?
Yeah, it's a pretty important one. So I'm going to make another version here just for protection. Why don't we do this? Why don't we do that step again? So with the clouds over the trees, not as realistic. So what I'm going to do is just use our luminance keyer here, and I'm just going to key. Actually, I'll just use a preset shadows, and I'm going to just do a key based on shadows. Get it really specific to just the shadows in the scene. And I'm pretty happy with that. So what this is going to do now is this is going to create a holdout on these trees. So this is going to punch back through the clouds to the trees and paste them over themselves. So you get a nice realistic edge here where there's no interaction with the trees and the clouds. They are behind the trees. And we just did that with a simple Luma key, and then we made it non-recursive. That's it.